There you go. And so today we have this is the Material Writers SIG session, and we have Adam Murray as the coordinator, I believe, of the SIG, and Dr. Brian Tomlinson, who will do this workshop. So please go ahead.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for making time to attend our SIG forum, even though it's a Wednesday night and many of us are busy with teaching. It is my honor to introduce Professor Tomlinson to you. He is a teacher trainer, a curriculum developer, a film extra, a football coach. He's done it all. And he's also an academic. I first became aware of him because of MATSTA, the International Materials Development Association. He is now a visiting professor at the University of Liverpool and a TESOL professor at Anaheim University. I'm quite excited for his upcoming book, SLA Applied, Connecting Theory and Practice. Let's give him a muted, warm welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, Adam. Good morning, everyone. Well, it's good morning here, actually. I'm speaking from Southport in England, where it is fairly early in the morning. If you don't know where Southport is, it's a small seaside town near to, in my view, the greatest city in the world. I'll give you a clue. It's a city which also has the best football team in the world. And the answer is, it's close to Liverpool. I spent all my life, I started off as a student at the University of Liverpool, way back in 1962, when the Beatles were playing at the university. I've spent the rest of my life living in 9 different countries around the world, and now I've come back. So now I can go, well, until recently, I could go and watch my beloved Liverpool every week. And I'll be watching on TV this coming week. Okay, so what I'd just like to say, well, I should also say that it's great to be back at JALT. I've attended and presented at JALT many times. Just wish I was actually in Japan, where I spent 3 very happy years at Kobe University. So let's hope maybe next year we'll be meeting in Japan at JALT. I'd like to start with an appeal, which might contradict what you've just been told. The appeal is this, that as you'll find out very quickly, I like to talk, and I can talk for hours and hours. So please do interrupt if you have a question, or if you have something to say, if you want to make a point about what I'm saying, or give an example. Or actually, if you want to just shout insults and abuse, I don't mind. I'm used to it. I often tell this story of my favorite teacher at a teacher training course. This was in the UK, Spanish teacher. It was a 2-week training course, workshop. And this lady every day used to sit just in front of me. And everything I said, she said, rubbish, nonsense. It wouldn't work with my class. And she rejected everything. We got on very well socially. We went out for drinks in the group, etc. No problem. But she rejected everything. 3 weeks later, I got a letter from her. Dear Brian, remember that nonsense you told us on the course? Well, I've tried it, and some of it works. And I was very, very happy because she'd followed the normal basic human instinct, which was to reject the unfamiliar and the possibly threatening. Then to think about it, to select from it, to evaluate, and to turn it into her own approach. So you'll find that many of the things I say are fairly controversial and provocative. So please feel free to shout, it won't work with my class or rubbish, but please also think it over, reflect upon it, and maybe try some of the suggestions and examples for yourself. I'm going to start in a rather strange way. My presentation is about bringing the coursebook to life. And my first example is not from the coursebook at all. I'm going to tell you a story. Oh, first of all, I should ask, are there many, is there anybody here from America, from the USA? Okay, I'm assuming there is.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay, in which case, my apologies to start with. Is there anyone here from Ireland? Maybe not. If there is, then my apologies, because this is a story about an American and an Irishman who were traveling on a plane from America to Europe, very long flight. And the American was rather bored, and he turned to the Irishman and he said, let's play a game. And the Irishman said, no, I'm tired. I think I just want to go to sleep. No, come on, let's play a game. All right, then. Look, I'll tell you what. I'll ask you a question. And if you can't answer it, you give me $10. You ask me a question. If I can't answer it, I'll give you $100. Okay, said the Irishman, let's play. And the American said to the Irishman, what's the distance between the Earth and the moon? The Irishman shrugged, put his hand in his pocket and gave the American $10. The American said to the Irishman, okay, it's your turn, ask a question. Now, the Irishman said, what goes up a hill with 3 legs and comes down with 2? What goes up a hill with 3 legs and comes down with 2? And the American couldn't think of an answer. And he was disturbed. And he thought and thought, and he checked on Wikipedia, and he even phoned friends, and the Irishman went to sleep. But an hour later, the American still couldn't come up with an answer. So he shook the Irishman, who was asleep, and he said to him, well, come on, I just don't know. All right. Here's your $100. He gave the Irishman $100. And the Irishman went back to sleep, and the American still was tormented by this. He just couldn't find an answer. So he woke up the Irishman again and said, come on, tell me, what's the answer? I really want to know. What does go up a hill with 3 legs and come down with 2? And the Irishman put his hand in his pocket and gave the American $10. Okay, now, question is, why have I started with a silly joke? And the answer is this. I never start a class with the course book. It's often a very negative way to start the class. The course book can't resist testing students. So almost immediately there are questions. The very first thing in any course book often is a question. And you start off this process of interrogation. What I do at the beginning of every lesson is to start with what I call a task-free activity. Task-free, there is no task. I simply tell a joke, read a short story, read a poem, read an extract from a newspaper, tell an anecdote about myself. Right? A short and potentially engaging text is the key thing. And all the learners do is relax and listen. No questions, no tasks. And that's the start of the lesson. I finish the poem or the story, leave a few minutes silence, and then remind them that there are copies of the text on my desk, which they can take at the end of the lesson and put into their loosely file. If they want to, they don't have to. So they're building up a library of texts which have engaged them. And they go back and read them, maybe 2 or 3 times. I don't ask any questions. There are no tests, no summaries, no reports. I don't check. Often they ask me questions, maybe 3 or 4 days later, about a text that I've read, about a joke or a poem. And the idea is simply to start the lesson in a relaxed and positive way. Positivity is what we're talking about today. Also, if you do this, you're massively increasing the learner's exposure to language in use. Ideally, engaged exposure to language in interesting use. And as we'll see in a minute, this is crucial for language acquisition. And also, as we'll see in a minute, there's very little of it in most course books. Now, this is something my ex-students are doing all over the world and reporting very often. It's the most popular and successful part of their course. So try it. You just simply come across an interesting text, or it doesn't have to be a joke. It could be very serious. You just simply collect it and build up a library of these potentially engaging texts. And at one point, you can throw it over to the students. The students collect the text and bring them to you, and you read them. Okay, so a little idea to start without the course book. So let me now focus on the course book. So I'm going to now go over to my PowerPoint. Remember, please interrupt at any time to make a point, ask a question, or shout abuse. Okay, so bringing the course book to life is my theme. Put my glasses on and see what I'm doing. And of course, straight away, PowerPoint. Okay, so the question is, well, obvious question, why do course books need bringing to life? And my point is, first point is that course books consist of lifeless words and illustrations on pieces of paper. Pretty obvious point, well, one worth making. And simply words and some illustrations provide very, very limited input. By input, I mean exposure to language in use. It's been shown through research into language acquisition that the richer the input, the more likely it is to become intake. I'm using intake to mean that portion of the input the learner takes into the brain for processing. It's always a very small part of the input. We tend to think that learners learn what teachers teach. No, they don't. And we tend to think that learners should learn everything in course book. No, they won't. They only intake a very small proportion of the input. Therefore, the richer the input, rich in the sense of quantity and quality, the larger will be the intake. When I say they're lifeless words, they're just words on a piece of paper. What has been shown is that the richest intake comes from input which is embodied, brought to life through the human being, through gesture, through facial gesture, through tone of voice, through all sorts of other means of communication. As language teachers, we tend to focus on language. Language is a small part of communication. There are all sorts of other aspects of communication, non-linguistic features of communication. which are vital for language acquisition. So if we just follow the course book as lifeless words, the input will be impoverished. So I'm going to demonstrate ways of putting life into those lifeless words. For course books to facilitate language acquisition, the words and illustrations need to interact. Interact is a key word. Language acquisition comes from interaction. One aspect of interaction is the mental interaction. The learner needs to interact with the input in their mind. So the words and illustrations need to interact with the minds of the learners. We tend to focus very much in our teaching on what the learners see with their eyes, what they hear with their ears, what they say with their mouth, what they say with their hands when they write or type. What really matters is what's going on in the mind. It is in the mind where we acquire language. And we're beginning to find out a lot more about what happens in the brain during language acquisition and what facilitates acquisition in the brain. That's what I'm going to be looking at. Excuse me. They also need to stimulate the learners to interact with others in the classroom and especially outside it. There is no way that anyone can learn a language just in a classroom. There is insufficient time and insufficient experience. I often say the teacher's main job in the classroom is to stimulate the learners to look for the language and experience it outside the classroom. I'll be talking about ways of doing that later. But this is a key point. I don't know any course book, and I've analyzed lots and lots of course books, which actually sets up activities in the course book for the learners to do outside the classroom. There might be one or two which have projects. I would say, excuse me, I would say in every unit, there should be activities for the learners to do outside the classroom, to establish this habit of looking for language experience outside the classroom. And wherever I've worked, everyone says, oh, it's impossible. There's no English outside the classroom. And the first lesson, I send them outside the classroom to look for English, and they find it. And then, of course, they realize it's out there on the web, it's in the library, it's in the newspaper, it's all around them. Okay, so the course book needs to do these two things, to stimulate interaction in the mind and stimulate interaction with others. There's a lot of recent research, including a very good book by Sato and Ballinger, showing that what is most effective in terms of language acquisition, in terms of production, ability to use, comes from interacting with others. And they've looked at interacting with the teacher, interacting with native speakers, and interacting with other learners. Interesting question. Which do you think is the most useful? What they found was the least useful was interacting with the teacher, because the teacher nearly always took the lead and dominated and interrogated and corrected and expected. Interaction with a native speaker who wasn't a teacher was more useful than interaction with the teacher, because they didn't expect as much and didn't dominate and interrogate as much. But the learners were nervous and were afraid to experiment and played safe. What they found was learners interacting with other learners was the most beneficial for language acquisition, particularly if this was in socially cohesive and collaborative groups, where the learners felt at ease and were helping each other. And this stimulated both implicit learning from the interaction and from meaning-focused activity, as well as explicit learning when they helped each other to improve or provided a word or corrected each other. So something to think about. There are activities in course books typically where learners get into group, but very, very often what they then do is a fairly closed activity with very little actual opportunity for communication. So it's communicating. When I say interacting with others, I'm emphasizing communication. And final point on this slide is, in order to achieve this mental and physical interaction, in my opinion, course books need to be humanized and to be energized into life. By humanized, I'm saying they needed to be connected to the learners, not just as a learner, but as an interesting, intelligent human being. It's my view that most course books certainly underestimate the learner and often, to be fair, insult the learner's intelligence by trivializing and limiting and restricting and simplifying and not challenging. So I'm saying we need to help them to stimulate this connection with the learner as an intelligent, interesting, individual human being. And we need to put energy into the course book. Learning needs energy. The brain needs oxygen. It's simple as that to learn. So the more energized the activity is, the more oxygen there is, both literally and metaphorically, and the more learning is likely to take place. Right, now bringing course books to life needs to be principled. By principled, I mean aiming to provide what's been found by research and observation to promote worthwhile and effective language acquisition. What is worthwhile and effective language acquisition? Isn't all language acquisition worthwhile and effective? And I would say no. That the tendency is to focus on accurate language production from language acquisition, which is often not particularly effective language use, because the focus on accuracy can restrict what the learner says and the effect of what they're saying. So I'm saying worthwhile and effective language acquisition results in learners being accurate. I'm not saying accuracy isn't important, being fluent, being appropriate, but most of all, being effective. My focus would be on effective communication. Very little of any focus on this in the course book. It tends to be all about accuracy and fluency. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is focus on 3 principles of acquisition, which I think are typically neglected in many course books. I should make it clear, I'm not attacking the course book. I'm a course book writer myself. But from my experience with publishers, I know what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. And I'm not blaming the publishers. The publishers know what sells, and what sells is what has face validity, what looks like a course book, what is typical of a course book. And unfortunately, what is typical of a course book very often is not what promotes language acquisition. So these are the 3, I say 3, this is many in one. These are my 3 principles I'm going to focus on. And I'm saying they're all essential for language acquisition to take place. First of all, rich. I'll come back and say what I mean by each word. Rich, meaningful, comprehensible, embodied, and recycled exposure to language in use. I've mentioned rich already. I'm arguing that input needs to be rich, exposure needs to be rich. in quantity, so masses of it, far, 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 far more than learners typically get. I've analyzed many, many course books recently for various publications, and there's a very impoverished exposure to language in use. In some course books, there's no language in use, it's just language in exemplification. So I'm saying there should be a lot of, if you like, authentic language in the course book. And from the course book, links to authentic language outside the course book. So rich in quantity, but also rich in quality. Quality in the sense of it's not restricted. It's not limited to one structure at a time. It's not, oh, we can't use past perfect because we haven't introduced it yet. Learners are very, very good at ignoring tenses, for example, that haven't been taught, and picking out from them the meaning from context and from the core. So I'm arguing most course books, no, I'm arguing all course books are too simple, too simplified, too restricted. It's done from a very commendable motive, which is a belief that simplifying, restricting, limiting, focusing helps the learner. The research shows it doesn't. It impoverishes the input, which impoverishes the intake, which reduces language acquisition. By meaningful, I mean of relevance, of significance, of salience to the learner. Okay, I don't mean we can understand it, but meaningful, of significance to the learner. Most course books are global course books, an impossible task for the writer to be meaningful to all learners. Therefore, the teacher has to do something to make the course book more meaningful to the learner. Comprehensible, a misunderstood word, goes way back to Krashen and comprehensible input. By comprehensible doesn't mean you can understand everything. It means you can understand enough for your purpose. It's sufficient. It's not total, but it's sufficient. Embodied, interesting focus very recently in research on embodied language. I mentioned it before. The idea that when we use language, we're not just using words. We're using visuals, we're using the body, we're using sound, we're using modulations, we're using context. And key word there, recycled, which is ignored by almost every course book. Lots and lots of researchers have demonstrated you cannot acquire language in the way that most course books present it. That is, this is an actual example of a course book. So I looked at the past perfect and found the past perfect did not appear in any unit in any way at all until Unit 12. Unit 12 was crammed full, flooded with past perfects. And then Unit 13 to 20, there wasn't a single past perfect. You cannot acquire language like that. It has to be recycled. Many experts say you must encounter a vocabulary item at least 9 or 10 times at different times, not at the same time, over an extended period, what they call spaced recycling, in order for any acquisition to take place. Many people have investigated recycling in course books and found that there isn't any. Okay, so then the key word there is language in use, not language in exemplification, not a simple example without context or cotext, but language in a context, in use, in communication. The next principle is the importance of the potential for affective and cognitive engagement. Just to explain what I mean by this. Engagement is focus, willing focus of attention, not being distracted. fixing all the energy and attention on a text or a task. By affective engagement, I'm talking about three things: emotion, so emotional engagement. That was one of the ideas of my story at the beginning, to start off with a laugh if possible. Laughter is affective engagement. The opposite is sadness, anger, sorrow, joy, happiness, positivity. These are all indicators of affective engagement. Also, positive environment is an indicator of affective engagement, and positive attitudes to language learning. By cognitive engagement, I'm talking about thinking, being fully focused on thinking for a solution of a problem, thinking out your reaction to somebody's views. And this is a fact. It's not just an opinion. The SLA research has shown that, and brain research has shown that in order to really acquire language, whilst you're experiencing it, the ideal is if you are affectively engaged, emotionally engaged, and cognitively engaged, if you're thinking and feeling. Most course books, again, these are massive generalizations, there are obviously exceptions. There is very little affective engagement because publishers are afraid of this. They're afraid of disturbing people, they're afraid of offending people, understandably. And cognitive engagement, simply because what tends to happen is intermediate learners or lower intermediate learners are treated as though they are lower intermediate human beings, lower intermediate intellectually. And therefore there's no cognitive challenge. The topics are very simple and often very trivial. So I'm saying we need to inject this affective and cognitive engagement. I'm looking around me because my wife has just let our dog out into the garden and the door's wide open and it's freezing cold. Okay, just being closed. And the third principle is opportunities to use the language for purposeful communication. And you would think, well, of course, there are course books full of this. There's lots of production activities. But if you look at them, most of them are practice rather than communication. Get into groups and have a conversation where one of you invites another one to the party. Use expressions like, oh, on Saturday, would you like to? This is language practice, it's not communication. Actually, look at some course books, you'll find there's very little actual communication goes on. And it's through communication that we acquire language, not from practice. A controversial statement there. I'm sure a lot of people will hammer me for that. We acquire language from communication, not from practice. Right, let me move on. And no one's interrupted yet, so please do come in and ask questions and make a point. I mentioned I've recently done quite a few analyses and evaluations of course books. There's some references there to where some of these analyses are published. At the end of the slide, I've got a list of references. And you will have access to the slides afterwards. So I won't go into detail on this. I've just mentioned one of them there, the Tomlinson and Masahara Impress. Impress actually means February 2021. So that should be published in the next couple of months. We're just finalizing it at the moment. And that is a book called SLA Applied, Connecting Theory and Practice. It looks at the basic findings of SLA research on what facilitates language acquisition, and then looks at what language planners, teachers, materials developers, assessors, teacher trainers can do to help learners to acquire language. Right, so this is my criticism of Coursebooks. Again, it's not an attack on Coursebooks. There are often very good reasons for this, but unfortunately, if we don't do something about this, our learners are getting a very impoverished experience. They tend to restrict the learners to intensive reading of or listening to simple texts, often contrived to illustrate a new teaching point. Look at the words there, restrict. That is the tendency of Coursebooks, to restrict and to contrive, and focus on intensive rather than extensive. Intensive reading or listening to simple texts is basically an impoverishment of input. You are often learners are micro-processing a text. They're focusing on bits of language, and they're focusing on the new teaching point. New is in inverted commas because we always assume that the tense is new or the vocabulary is new, when hopefully learners might have encountered this in text they've been reading on the web, outside the classroom. It doesn't matter what is new, what isn't new. What matters is recycled experience. But this restriction is a big problem. And these two key words here feature such closed and shallow activities. You'll recognize the activities: true, false, matching, filling in the blanks, word substitution, sentence completion, closed comprehension. These aren't learning activities, these are testing activities. They come from exams where they are used because they're easy to set and easy to mark, and they are reliable. Therefore, they're closed. Closed and shallow activities do not promote language acquisition. The closed activity where there's only one answer, there's no thought. There's no cognitive engagement, you're right or wrong. There's no development, no elaboration, no creativity, no criticality. And they're shallow. Without this engagement, then the actual activity is shallow. And you need deep activities for deep processing for language acquisition. And there's the word restrict again. So often the learners are restricted to practice of just taught language, which in production activities which manipulate them to use the just taught language points. I've just given an example. Get into groups. A invites B to a party, use the following expressions which have just been taught. So it's a rather negative view of the course book, and there are many, many exceptions, I should point out. But this is based not on my view, but on my and other people's analysis and evaluation of course book. This is what happens. Right, long introduction. None of the activities listed on the previous slide satisfy my selected criteria. The criteria of exposure to language in use, engagement, and opportunities to communicate. They all constrain the learners and impoverish their intake and output. Now, in most cases, we have no choice but to use course books. We can't, for example, when I worked at Kobe University, I was told each class had to have a course book. There was no choice. But I didn't follow the course books slavishly. I didn't follow the course book. I used the course book as a resource. I exploited the course book. And of course, you can't completely rewrite the book. You don't have time, and it's not possible. So what I'm going to focus on now, after that long introduction, is ways of making small changes to the materials which will increase their potential to facilitate language acquisition. I'm now just going to give lots of examples. Some of them are participatory, so please join in. And again, you'll find more examples in these references. Right, first of all, what I call performing the course book. Sounds strange, performing the course book. How do you perform the course book? Performance of the course book consists of a human enactment of the words on the page. It's bringing those lifeless words to life through a human enactment, performing them. It's live. But this is not watching a recording, it's live. It needs to be live to inject the energy. And it's in the classroom. Sometimes augmented by props, visuals, and effects. And I'm going to argue that performing the course book can augment, enrich, embody, and energize the course book. Can also achieve those three principles of exposure, engagement, opportunities for communication. Right, now some actual examples. Here's a simple one of teacher performance. Sounds strange, doesn't it? People are always talking about teacher talking time, must reduce teacher talking time. Complete nonsense in my view. For many students, their only access to language in use is the teacher. So the teacher plays a vital role of providing exposure to language in use. So it's not about quantity of teacher talking time, but quality. All right? All right, the teacher droning on about the past perfect is not necessarily quality teacher talking time, but the teacher performing a course book is. So here's an example of what I call a lead-in activity. There's a particular course book here, Clare and Wilson, 2012. There's a text, the advantages and, a unit, the advantages and disadvantages of modern technology. And I would always give a lead-in to this, often personal. A lot of evidence, research evidence showing students around the world, this is universal, really enjoy and benefit from the teacher talking about himself or herself. So I tell lots of personal stories, not all of them true. So this is my lead in to this unit on advantages and disadvantages of modern technology. So imagine you're the class and I'm the teacher. Well, as you can see, I'm a bit of an old fogey. I'm not particularly computer competent. Recently, I bought a new printer. After a couple of weeks, the print was very faint. So I took it back to the shop where I bought it. And I showed it to the assistant and he said, oh yeah, that's not a problem. We can fix that for you. Yeah, it'll cost you £50. Well, or you could do it yourself, you know. If you look at page 3 of the handbook, there's a very simple way of rectifying this problem. Oh, thanks very much, I said. That's very nice of you. Does your boss know you give this advice to your customers? And he said, oh yeah, it's his idea. What we found is if we get customers to try and repair things themselves first, we can charge them a lot more money when they eventually bring the computer or printer back to us to be repaired. So, and then you go into the unit, very simple lead in. Here's another one for the same unit. This is so at the beginning of the lesson, I'm talking to the students. I'm just going to read you a letter I found from a guy called Peter White. Sir, I haven't got a computer, but I was told about Facebook and Twitter, and I'm trying to make friends outside Facebook and Twitter while applying the same principles. Every day I walk down the street and tell passers-by what I've eaten. how I feel, what I've done the night before, and what I'll do for the rest of the day. I give them pictures of my wife, my daughter, my dog, me gardening and on holiday, spending time by the pool. I also listen to their conversations, tell them that I like them, and give them my opinion on every subject that interests me, whether it interests them or not. And it works. I already have 4 people following me. 2 police officers, a social worker, and a psychiatrist. Okay, so you get the idea of not, I don't start the lesson with the course book, and I don't start the unit with the first activity. There's a lead in first. Right, here's another example of a teacher performance. This is a dramatic performance of a text in Hanfield and Ben. I'll show you the text in a minute. Very interesting text, but in my view, very mundane activities. Right, so imagine this is the beginning of the lesson, and I come in, and I'm a fairly new teacher with this class. So I say to 2 students at the front of the class, oh, could you just remind me of your names? So Mario and Pedro, okay. Okay, everyone, I'm going to act for you the beginning of a story. I'd like you to just relax and watch my terrible acting. There are two characters in this story, Pedro and Mario. I'm playing both characters. As you'll see, they both look alike and sound alike. Well, that's because they're twin brothers, and I'm hopeless at accents. So as you watch and listen, try to imagine where they are and what they're doing. Right, now you're not going to be able to see me acting this out. I tell you, I would be standing, and during this, I would be walking up and down, attempting to, sorry, I'm talking to you, not to the students, attempting to impersonate 2 people walking, which is not easy. Right, so go back to being the students. Okay, everyone, so just watch and listen and imagine what these 2 people, Pedro and Mario, are doing. You know something funny? I've forgotten which side is which. You've what? I've forgotten which side we're supposed to be guarding from the other. You idiot. Some soldier you are. Well, which is it then? To our right, we have our glorious homeland, and to our left, the barbaric wastes. Now. And then I stop and ask the question, what's the problem? Okay, so a challenge to work out what the problem is. And then I continue. What do you mean now? Home is always on my right-hand side. I've memorized it. It can't always be on your right, because if you turned around, then your right would be where your left is. Oh. Okay, so we now go into problem-solving activity. I'm going back to talking to you. And I just simply ask the students, in pairs, solve the problem, and then act out the solution. I'm giving you a very demanding task here because you can't see what I will actually be doing. But when I've done this, the students do work out what the situation is, which is that the 2 brothers are guarding. They're actually on a wall guarding their country from invaders from the enemy on the other side. But the problem is, because both countries look exactly the same, one of them can never remember which side is which, but he's memorized it's always on the right. Of course, it can't be, because when he turns around, it's then on his left. And so the students have to solve the problem and then act out to another pair their solution. So this is quite a creative activity and quite a fun activity. And students, for example, have come up with the solution that they march one way forward, and then when they get to the end of the march, they come backwards, and all sorts of silly solutions. I encourage silliness in my classes. There is a very serious theory called the Bizarreness Theory, which claims, and I agree with it, there's a lot of evidence, the more bizarre the experience, the more memorable it is. And the students came up with lots of bizarre solutions. Right, so at the moment, the students haven't gone to the course book at all. Then they go to the course book and they read the text. Here's the beginning of the text. It's from a graphic novel, and you can see the long winding wall and the two brothers having this problem. Very interesting book, actually. And then the students answer post-reading questions, not the closed questions from the course books, which I'll show you in a minute, but open-ended questions. This is one thing you can do with the course book, turn the closed questions into open-ended questions. That provides a challenge, creates possibility of cognitive engagement, pushes the learners to be creative, and enhances the possibility of acquisition. So some examples of open-ended think questions would be, what does the war remind you of? Always after a text, my first question is a personal one, connecting the text to the lives of the learners, which is what we do when we read in the L1. Our first thought is about ourselves, how it connects to ourselves. So what does the war remind you of? And you get some interesting discussions going on. And then, what do you think of the idea of building a wall between two countries? A very topical question at the moment. And then the final activity is the students write a short story, either individually, in pairs, or in groups, called The Wall Between Us. The Wall Between Us, which gives a lot of scope for creativity. So this is language use, it's not language practice. You can do things afterwards where they swap stories and monitor and help each other, which is explicit learning, before they're given in to the teacher, not for marking, but for feedback. I'll show you what a course book did with this. Before the text, do you enjoy reading comics and graphic novels? It's a closed question. No, yes. Are graphic readers for adults popular in your country? No. It's closing communication rather than opening it. Read the extract and answer the questions. This is typical course book. Read the following text and then answer the questions. There are always questions. There's always an interrogation. They call it comprehension check, but why? What does it do? Of what value is it? What are the men's jobs? Well, they've already said soldier, so it's obvious. It's a surface question. It's shallow. Are they friends or enemies? Obviously, they're friends. What's the problem? Right? So not what is the problem, but in my activity, find a solution to the problem. And then suddenly it goes, read the text again, which is good. The more you go back to the text, the better. And find these words and expressions, positive adjective and negative adjective. Then that's it. You don't do anything else with that text. So there's no affective engagement, no positive engagement. no opportunity to communicate, no opportunity to use language. Right, another one, a different example, what I call character impersonation. This is from a textbook called Time to Listen by McCullough and Wright. Maria and Roz were actually students of mine on an MA course in Leeds. It's an MA course in materials development. And they've gone on to become very successful course book writers. And they wrote this very good course book for medical practitioners, non-native speaker medical practitioners. An excellent course book, but they were constrained by the publishers into basically giving a text, a very, very affectively engaging text, as you'll find, but having to set conventional activities to achieve face validity and sell the book. So I've adapted it. So imagine you are medical practitioners doing a course in language development. And I've got the lesson here. So please get into groups of 3. Obviously you can't. Imagine you're in a group of 3. One of you is a doctor, one is a patient, and one's an observer. If you're the patient, you're going to tell the doctor what's wrong with you. If you're the observer, read the note on the desk addressed to you. So there's a little note for the observer. The other 2 don't see it. So the observer's task is simply to time how long it takes before the doctor interrupts the patient. The students playing the doctor and patient don't know this. Right. Okay. And then we have a good laugh because always, and I've done this all over the world, the doctor interrupts after about 10 seconds very often. Okay, so listen to what happened when a doctor decided not to interrupt a patient. And the teacher now introduces Dr. Barr, who summarizes what he says in A Time to Listen, which is a book he's written. And what I've done, there's a text here which called A Time to Listen. It's written for medical practitioners, so a lot of it's in medical language and it's not easy to follow, but it is potentially very affectively engaging. So what I'm going to do here, rather than give them the text, which will be demanding in a way I don't want it to be, I want it to be challenging cognitively, but not to be challenging linguistically. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Barr, who will summarize what he says, focusing on the affective issues and omitting the medical terminology at this stage. Okay, so imagine I'm Dr. Barr. Morning, everyone. As your teacher says, I'm Dr. Barr. I'm a teacher. Sorry, I'm not a teacher at all. I'm a doctor and a researcher. And I've been very interested in doctor-patient interaction, and especially in the tendency of doctors to interrupt the patient. And in my research, I found that typically female practitioners, doctors, physicians, nurses, waited an average of 3 minutes before interrupting the patient. Male physicians, practitioners, waited an average of 47 seconds. So, yeah. Good morning, Mr. Smith. What brings you here today? Mr. Smith tries to say. After 47 seconds, the doctor interrupts. So I decided I'd try an experiment. With my next patient, I'd just simply wait as long as was necessary and let her talk as long as she wanted. And the next patient was a lady in her 70s, and she greeted me with a smile. And I said to her, "Hello, I'm Dr. Barr. What's the problem that brings you here today?" And she began to describe the past several weeks of her life. It had to do with a co-worker noticing something, talking with her sister on the phone, her reluctance to see doctors. The word cough kept surfacing, kept on coming up. She was looking at her medicines, not knowing which to choose. She was needing to dress warmly because it was very cold. And she went on and on, had problems sleeping. My nurse opened the door and gestured to the people waiting outside, but I still let the lady carry on. And she actually went on for 22 minutes. 22 minutes before. Well, I didn't interrupt, I just let her talk. But what this revealed was there's a problem with a cough, and she was cold. And I examined her, and I suspected that in fact she had a lung problem and possibly lung cancer. So I sent her to see the specialist, and he confirmed my diagnosis. And in fact, she had very advanced lung cancer. And he sent her back to me for antibiotics to try and bring the infection under control before they did further tests. And when she came back to me, I said to her, "This hasn't been a very good day for you, has it?" She looked at me for a moment with an unmistakable smile on her face. She reached out her hand and patted me on the wrist. "Oh, don't worry about all that. I've had a good life. I just wanted you to know this is the best doctor visit I've ever had. You're the only one who ever listened." Right, and then what happens is Dr. Barr invites the students to read the actual text. Notice I do this a lot. Rather than say, read the text, answer the questions, I perform it, I dramatize it, I summarize it, I introduce it. And then afterwards, they read it. And Dr. Barr challenges them that as they are reading it, try to think of a way of allowing patients enough time to talk about their problem without creating long queues of patients waiting to see the doctor. Very difficult task, actually, very demanding. This is instead of the comprehension questions. And then the task. Dr. Barr tells his students, I'm really interested in this, so I'm organizing a meeting to listen to ideas about how to increase patient and doctor time without creating long queues of patients. So you're invited to give a presentation at this meeting. So yeah, please prepare a presentation for the meeting. You can do this individually, in pairs, or in a small group. Your teacher will be around to help you, so call the teacher over if you have any problems. And I'll come back in about half an hour and we'll have the meeting. Okay, so you get the idea of, instead of just reading this difficult text and then answering comprehension questions, you extract the affective core of it, engage the learners, and then challenge them with a problem. And then they read the text and try and come up with and present a solution. So this is conforming to my three principles. There is a lot of exposure to language in use, affectively and cognitively engaging, or at least the potential is there, and a lot of opportunities for communication. And number 9 was they give their presentation. Right, here's an example of learner performance, which I call brief encounter in the shoe shop. And very often in course books, there are dialogues. So these days, not as many as there used to be. And the idea is A and B practice the dialogue. And similar idea here, the students perform dialogues from the course book with half the class performing A and half performing B. So instead of in pairs, it's half the class who are actually performing A and half performing B. Now what I've done is to take a dialogue which is simply a shoe shop transaction between an assistant and a customer. And I've given it a twist, so there's a context. And the context, for example, is that students are told that the new salesman in the shoe shop, so the salesman is new, has recently got divorced from the regular customer. So the salesman is new, the customers are regular. They recently got divorced, so ex-husband, ex-wife, and neither expects to meet the other in the shop. It's a big shock. So they're not reading, chanting the text, they are performing it, they're acting it. It's going to be difficult for us to do here, but we'll have a go. I'll change this slightly so that I'm playing the salesman in red and you are the customer. Remember, you used to be married to me. Very painful thought, but this is the situation. And you have come to buy some shoes. You certainly didn't know that I was working in the shoe shop and you didn't expect to meet me. So we'll go through it. It's quite it's longer than the one slide. So I will read aloud or perform aloud the salesman. I'd like you to perform the customer. Do it aloud, or if you don't want to, do it in your inner voice. Good morning, madam. What can I do for you today? Certainly, madam. What size do you take? What about these? For a special occasion? Well, what about these? Shall I help you, madam? How are those? That'll be £180. Customer starts to walk out of the shop with the shoes. Wait a minute, madam. What's your name? Thank you, madam. Hope to see you again soon. So you get the idea. Bringing the course book to life. An interesting activity I found is for the students to add inner voice utterances to the dialogue. Whenever we talk with our external voice, we're also talking with our inner voice, and often the dialogue is very different. So it could be, for example, like this. The salesman sees the customer, his ex-wife, and says, "Oh no, it's you." But what he actually says externally is, "Good morning, madam." And she says to herself, "What the hell are you doing here? Good morning." Right? So the students write now an inner voice dialogue to go alongside it. And when they've done this, they perform their dialogues. They do this as a pair. They perform the dialogues, so that's starting with the inner voice for each character and then the outer voice. Great fun. A well-known member of JALT, Mark Hagelson, might actually be there, has done this in a course book he wrote for career for young learners. And he sent me some examples of the very, very creative work the young learners have done. So it's opening up creativity. Oh yeah, it's an example of interactive performance. A few more examples, and then I better stop and we're going to a question time. Okay, this is a course book. Says reading, read this version of a traditional Korean folk tale. and choose the best title. Then afterwards there are yes, no questions. So, and then it goes into, that's it. Typical course book don't exploit the text. You just use it for some token questions. So again, the idea is to perform it, but this is interactive between teacher and students and student and student. So this is a story about two brothers, one of them called Hungbu and the other called Nolbu. Nolbu is the older brother. His younger brother is called Hungbu. And the idea is the teacher performs the text. And when the teacher is talking about what the brothers are doing, the brothers mime the action. And it's done in large groups, half the class is one brother, half the class is the other brother. So that some students, if they want to, they feel embarrassed, can hide. I'm a great believer in the value of letting students hide, providing they're watching the others. There is evidence that very often in group work, the students who learn most are those who are silent, but are listening to and watching the others. They're interacting mentally. So the teacher reads a story while the students act out their characters. Oh, that comes. Okay, well, we'll just do this quickly. Oh, right. Did you decide who you want to be? Just choose whether you want to be Nobu, the older brother, or Hungbu, the younger brother. When I'm reading your bit, right, there's nobody with you. Just perform the actions. Try it. See how it works. Oh, and I should say I'm playing the father. Long ago, there was a rich man. The rich man is me, obviously. Long ago, there was a rich man who had two sons. The older brother, who was called Nolbu, was greedy and lazy. So the students playing Nolbu act out being greedy and lazy. And at first, this is a bit strange, but some of them are having fun and start exaggerating, ham acting. By contrast, his younger brother, Hungbu, and I will point to the other half of the class, was hardworking and kind-hearted. And they act that out. When their father died, oh, there, that's me, chosen the wrong part as usual. When their father died, Nolbu inherited his house and land, but Hungbu received nothing. So Nolbu rejoices, Hungbu looks sad. One day when Hungbu was working in the fields, he found the bird which had broken its leg. He took the bird home and looked after it carefully. The bird gradually became stronger, and when summer came, it flew away to a warm place. A year later, the bird flew back and gave Hungbu a seed. Hungbu sowed the seed, and it soon grew into a plant which produced many gourds. When Hungbu opened one of the gourds, he was amazed to see that it was full of treasure. The next day, he bought an enormous house and moved there with his family. I'm reading this normally at the moment, but I would read it slowly, pausing to let the students act. And as it goes on, more and more participate and get sillier and sillier and more fun. When he heard about his brother's good luck, Nolbu was extremely jealous and decided to do the same as his brother. He also found a bird, but he broke its leg and looked after it until it became strong. The bird also gave him a seed, which produced several gourds. However, when Nolbu opened one of the gourds, goblins immediately came out of it and stole all his money. After that, Nolbu felt ashamed, so he went to his brother to ask for help. Hungbu was sorry for him, and so he invited him to share his house. Both brothers and their families lived happily ever after. So it's a pretty mundane story, not particularly interesting to read in my view, but you can bring it to life through I mean, I didn't perform it, I just read it, but normally I would perform it and exaggerate it, and the students respond in kind. Afterwards, it says, read the story again. Are these sentences true or false? So Ambu became rich. Is this true or false? So instead of doing that fairly mundane activity, I would interview the characters. So for example, Hangbu, are you rich? And one of the students would say yes. And I would say, well, have you always been rich? No. Oh, Nobu, are you rich? No. Did you used to be rich? Yes. Oh, so what happened, Nobu? How did you become rich? And someone will say, oh, I inherited, my father left me his money. Oh, what about Hangbu? Did your father leave anything to Hangbu? Well, did you give him anything? Well, why not? So it is personalized and dramatized, and performed. So sounds weird, performing yes, no questions. Whoops, right, I'm getting towards the end of my time. So that was all number one, performing the course book. I stress that because I believe that's one of the best ways of bringing the course to life, bringing the course book to life. So adding readiness activity. Readiness activity is just something which activates the learner's mind in relation to the topic of the test, of the course book of the unit. Give you a quick example, and then I'm really going to have to stop. Here's an example. My very first teaching was in Nigeria when I was very, very young. And I was given a course book, my first lesson, just before I went in. And I looked at it, and it was on making igloos. Eskimos making igloos in Nigeria. What? This is Nigeria. They've never seen snow, never heard of it. So I needed to very quickly come up with a way of localizing it as a readiness activity. So I said to them, do you all live in villages? And they did. In your village, how do you make your house? And they told me. So I'm starting with the students, not the course book. I always start and finish with the students. And they told me about how they went into the forest, chopped down trees to use wood. So I then said, oh, that's interesting. It's very similar in many ways to how people in the Arctic make their houses. There are no trees, but they use snow. So you're going to read about how these people make their houses. So I started off by creating a similarity, a connection. Simple one here before going back to that one on technology. Just ask students to see a picture in your mind of using technology. Is it working well? Are you happy with it? So personalizing it. Tell a partner about the experience with technology from the pictures in your mind. And then we start. Attention activity is the opposite. You'll be able to read this afterwards, so I won't go into it, where you find an extended text on the same topic. This one happens to be by quite a famous Japanese author, Kentaro Tayama. Once an enthusiastic supporter of technology, but now writing a book warning about it. So I'll leave you to read that yourselves. Right, personalization. An example here. Oh, all right. Grammar section of this course book focuses on robots. Gives the following: read sentences 1 to 8. Match the words in bold with the meaning A to D. Typical matching activity. A robot may create another robot. A robot has to know that it is a robot. Modal, modals. Focuses on modals. It's not about robots, it's about modals. So I'd start by making it about robots. And I'd tell a joke about robots. Here's a joke, a rather adult joke about robots. A father buys a lie detector robot that slaps people when they lie. So the robot slaps people when they lie. He decides to test it out at dinner one night. The father asks his son what he did that afternoon. The son says, I did some schoolwork. The robot slaps the son. The son says, okay. I was at a friend's house watching movies. And Dad asks, well, what movie did you watch? And the son says, Toy Story. The robot slaps the son. The son says, okay, we were watching porn. The dad says, what? At your age? I didn't even know what porn was. And the robot slaps the father. And the mother laughs and says, well, he certainly is your son. And the robot slaps the mother. Right, so starting with a joke, starting with a human story rather than just with modals. But then I would do the activity. So often I would add something and then actually do the course book. If you don't, the students can get a bit annoyed. You know, we bought the course book, why are we not using it? And then I'd do the following. Right at the beginning of a short story in which you bought a robot and taken it home. In the extract, show the robot around your home and talk to it about its duties. Swap stories with other students in the class. If you're really interested in robots, then read Ian McEwan's novel, Machines Like Me. It's a novel in which he does actually buy a robot and take it home, and the robot takes over. Right. I think what I'll do is, these are pretty self-evident. Oh, just this one actually, because typical activity in pairs, decide on the rules for a library, complete the sentences using, etc. So something you keep quiet in the library, obviously you have to, it's closed, there's only one answer, there's no real thought. I change this, use the words I give you to complete each of the sentences. You blank, keep quiet in the library. So it's the same one, but they have to use can't and because. You can't keep quiet in the library because. You've got to really think about that. It's quite challenging. See if you can come up with an answer why I let my dog out again. Let me see. Sandy, come on. Right, I'm back. Sorry about that. Okay, very key one. You'll be able to read these, so I'll just go through them very, very quickly. Opening up closed activities. Typical, complete the sentences with already, always, ever. You got a sentence, back to snow. I've blank seen snow. I've the only word which fits is never. So you put it in. Maybe you've seen a lot of snow. Maybe you lived in northern Japan. So it's not connected to the learner. So what I've done is complete the following sentences about yourself. I've already, but. I've always, but. I've never, but. So you're practicing the same words, but now it's personalized. It's opened up. And students draw their interpretation rather than answering questions, interview characters. I'll leave this for you to read yourselves. Yeah, that's self-evident. Okay, I think what I'll do is come to an end now, because most of the other activities are there on the slide and are self-evident, and they're there for you to read. So I'll come out of, yeah, I'll come out of there, back into there, and invite questions.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Dr. Tomlinson. And I would like everybody to unmute themselves and give Dr. Tomlinson a big hand. Can everybody do that? Can you hear it?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's very hard. Yes, thank you so much for all the stories too. So now let's, we have just a few minutes for question and answer. So please go ahead. Anybody? You can unmute yourselves. I understand that Marcus has post the PDF of the slides at the end of this talk. So thank you, Marcus, for that. And there's another one too, bringing the course book to life. Yes, that's the PDF that he was referring to.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any questions from the floor? Then I can spotlight you.
I guess not a question, but that was just incredibly interesting. Thank you so much, Professor Tomlinson, for your discussion. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Of course, the idea is not just to follow the examples, but to stimulate you to think of ways of doing it yourself. It's very easy, actually, once you get the idea, bring it to life. Thank you.
I have a question. If that's
Okay, who's
me? I raised my
Sarah,
hand.
go ahead.
Sarah?
Yeah. It's just kind of for my own research, but I'm wondering how many textbooks are actually based on corpora. So you're talking about the different grammar, but I think if you limit the vocabulary, you could introduce more grammar points. Does that make sense? So like limiting words based on frequency in the actual text, is that done often?
Sorry, sir, I didn't quite hear the beginning of the question.
I was wondering how many textbooks are actually based on corpora, like a frequency-based list?
Oh, very few. Some of my students have investigated this and written, published on it. It's interesting. A lot of publishers now have their own corpora, but actually don't make use of them when writing the course books because they're in different departments. It's all compartmentalized. There are some. The problem is, though, what I found is, particularly if you get into written text, readability, okay, if you're, for example, concentrating on frequently used words, which most of the vocab experts suggest should happen, there is a danger that you end up with texts which are comprehensible but not engaging. And if you take texts and start reducing them and simplifying them to take out the less frequently used vocabulary, you end up dehumanizing the text very often. I have found that learners are far more tolerant of words they don't understand than we think they are. I'll give you a very quick example. I did an experiment using the novel Vanity Fair. I gave intermediate students a page from the actual original novel, very difficult. And I gave them a page from a graded reader version. They didn't know this, they didn't know which was which. And I asked them afterwards, which one do you prefer? Every single student preferred the original. And they said, well, I didn't understand a lot of it, but it made me frightened. It made me excited about the battle. It was the night before a battle. The graded reader, they said, well, I understood everything, but it wasn't very boring. It wasn't very interesting. So this question of engagement is vital, and you can be engaged in a text where you don't actually understand some of the words. So although I take your point, and I agree with you that there should be more use made of corpora, there is a danger of dehumanizing, reducing the text.
Well, couldn't you keep it within like, so most of the ERT research or whatever that I hear is like 98% comprehensibility or something for like kind of ease. So couldn't you keep that 98% frequency and then inject 2% that's kind of more natural or something, I guess?
I should say, whoops, have to be careful here. I think the 98% is nonsense, complete nonsense. The 98, this belief that students need to know 98% of the vocabulary to understand the text is based upon tests, post-tests of vocabulary. It's not based upon global tests of the enjoyment and comprehension of the text. Everything I've done with extensive readers contradicts this. And I think there's a great danger in that, in restricting the learners unnecessarily. I've tried this myself with French, which I don't speak and I'm not very good at. And I've managed to understand texts where I just don't understand maybe 20 or 30% of the words, but it's engaged me. I've got the emotion from it. We've got to find a balance between understanding the words and appreciating the text.
Yeah.
We could talk about this one for hours, but
I'm sorry to interrupt. The session is over at 8:30. And I know that there will be another meeting here at, I think,
oh, sorry, right.
45. I'm sorry, Dr. Tomlinson.
Yeah,
But I
right.
think I'm asking Adam if we can continue this for those people who want to talk to Dr. Tomlinson. Adam, is that okay?
Yes, we could continue for about 5 more minutes.
All right.
Yeah, I'm happy. Yeah.
Then there are other breakout rooms if people wanted to have a discussion.
On the hangout rooms. All right. Okay.
But we have our meeting, our
All right.
annual general meeting from
Okay.
8:45.
Yeah. So everybody, is that okay? I have to end the meeting, the session. Well, okay, another 5 minutes, I guess. Right.
Yeah, maybe one more question or
One
comment.
more question. Sorry, Sarah. Okay, I guess. So everybody again, give a big hand of applause to Dr. Tomlinson, and thank you very much for coming today. And unmute your mic, and yes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And
you.
I'm going to end the
Thank you.
Just one
recording.
second. Could you tell us
At the end of the slides, there's an advert for a Master Conference in Penang next August on basically creativity in materials writing. But we'd love to see you there. It's myself, Rod Ellis, Alan Maley, Jaya Makundan, Itomi Masahara are the speakers. But we welcome, it gives you instructions on how to send me an abstract. But we'd love to see a lot of people from Japan there. And also, if you go to the Master website, we have a journal called Folio. We'd love articles from you on your materials and your experience. Maybe on doing this, I'm bringing the course book to life. So I look forward to seeing you in Penang.
Well, thank you.
Welcome to Penang, yeah? I'm from Malaysia.
Oh,
From Malaysia.
Yeah.
Dr. Ling.
Sorry, in Malaysia, yeah. University Science Malaysia is the
Yes.
is the host.
Okay.
Welcome to my country.
Okay, thank you. I will turn off the recording and stop it.